Good evening, everyone. I think we still have a few more folks trickling in the virtual room tonight, but we're just going to go ahead and get started because I know that everyone's eager to hear from our guests this evening. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I'm the Vice President of Public Relations and Programming here for the History Center. I am so thrilled to be welcoming you this evening for this really special conversation with author Leah Weiss for her new book, All the Little Hopes, and she will be in conversation with Jessica Handler. So this is normally where I would tell you where you could purchase a copy of tonight's book from our online museum store. However, Leah's book was so popular that has been back ordered. So we are waiting for our shipment. It is in the mail right now. So bad problem for us, great problem for Leah, and really a testament to how well the release has gone. But you will receive a follow-up email after this event showing you where you can buy your copy of the book this evening. And we always encourage you, if you can, to do so from Atlanta History Center because your purchase helps support the programming that we do here. Let me briefly introduce tonight's guests. I think they need very little introduction to most of you on here this evening. Leah is a Southern writer and novelist born in North Carolina and raised in the foothills of Virginia. Her debut novel, If the Creek Don't Rise, was released in August of 2017, and her short stories have been published in the Simple Life magazine, Everyday Fiction, and Deep South magazine. She retired in 2015 from a 24-year career as executive assistant to the headmaster at Virginia Episcopal School, and she now pursues a second career in writing full-time. Jessica Handler is the author of The Magnetic Girl, which won many different recognitions when it came out, including the Wall Street Journal's Spring 19 pick. She's the author of nonfiction books Braving the Fire, A Guide to Writing About Grief, and Invisible Sisters, a memoir. She writes essays and nonfiction features that have appeared in NPR, in Tin House, Drunken Boat, Full Grown People, Brevity, The Bitter Southerner, Electric Literature, Newsweek, The Washington Post, and More magazine. She's a lecturer in English at Oglethorpe, right here in Atlanta, and she lectures internationally on writing craft. Leah and Jessica, thank you both so much for being with us this evening virtually in Atlanta. Welcome.
Claire, thank you so much. Leah, it's so nice to see you again.
You too. I missed you this summer. I missed you last year. I'm really happy to have this time with you, Jessica.
And we'll get into how we know each other and how we know the part of the country in which All the Little Hopes takes place. But I'd like you to start us off by reading a section for us from this gorgeous book.
I am happy to. Usually I've been choosing the prologue, the beginning of the book. And tonight I thought, well, let me kind of venture a little different way. And I'm going to the very center of the book, chapter 29, because the story is told by two girls, Lucy and Bert. And in this particular excerpt, you're going to hear Lucy's voice, but speaking about Bert. So it's called Last Dance. In the heart of April, when the Nazis have morphed into something benign, we get exciting news. A military traveling band is coming to town. The band is called the Top Hats, and posters go up on telephone poles and in storefront windows. They play big band music, so we practice the swing and jitterbug with Irene. We turn up the radio, push back the table, and work up a sweat, dancing to Harry James, Benny Goodman, and our favorite, Glenn Miller. Some local dances are held in the high school gymnasium, but this one will be held in the tobacco warehouse because it's bigger. The warehouse is our community center when it's not auction time. Square dances and bluegrass music and local talent shows are held on some Saturdays. This is the first big band to play. This Friday, we pile in the back of a truck and Grady drives. The dance music reaches our ears before we even get there. Grady warns us to stay in the truck till it stops. Then we're off for the time of our lives. I don't know half the people at the dance, and that makes it extra exciting. The musicians are men in white uniforms, and they play swing as good as the real thing. Irene pulls us out on the floor to dance in public. Byron Toots holds his own next to Irene. Cora and Lydia coax Tiny Jr. from the corner, and he shifts from one foot to the other, moving to his own beat. Bert is swept up in a cluster of admirers she could care less about. Nobody has her attention till a new band member jumps up on stage. Hello, everybody. I'm Frankie Tinder. He croons into the microphone, a man in uniform who is movie star handsome. Women get up on tiptoes to see him better. A spotlight shines on his perfect hair and polished belt buckle. He sings, "You made me love you." And the girls rush the stage to watch him. They sway to the beat singing, "I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it." And they love on him with their eyes. His voice is as smooth as Bing Crosby's. He even whistles like Bing. I watch his eyes land on Bert and lock in a possessive way. Bert possesses him back. The words he sings are for her. She is magnetic. The light from the warehouse rafter shines down on her. I feel a pinch in my breast and pit of my stomach from the chemistry I heard Irene talk about to Helen. Chemistry I'm witnessing, but have never experienced firsthand. Even secondhand, it's heady stuff. The first set of songs ends and the musicians take a break. Most of them step outside for a smoke, but Frankie Tinder walks off the stage and parts the sea of ladies who reach out to touch his arm, his back, his shoulder. He walks over to Bert Tucker. He's the perfect height, standing next to her, looking down, making her look up. Her profile is luminous, and her hair spills down her back like the tresses of Lauren Bacall and Ingrid Bergman. Frankie Tinder reaches in his pocket and pulls out a folded piece of paper. He brushes it with his lips before he hands it to her. Bert boldly tucks it down the top of her dress. That's when Ricky Miller sidles up, chomping on peanuts, looking like a country bumpkin next to Bert's admirer, who's far too old for her, but still the stuff of dreams. Bert has an honest-to-God military singing man under her spell, and it's reciprocated. But what is she gonna do? What can she do? After the dance, Frankie Tinder will move on to the next town, and Bert will stay here. Will tonight be enough for my friend? There you go. Little 3-minute job there.
Very nice.
You're so welcome. So fun.
That's fantastic. And this is a real pivot in the story is what happens.
Yes, it is.
I'm not going to give anything away. Before we get into the how and why and wherefore of All the Little Hopes, you write about a part of the country where you and I met, and it's a beautiful part of the world, not far from Mount Mitchell in North Carolina.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your relationship to this place and why this book is set in that part of the world.
You know, I don't know whether you've ever gone somewhere, Jessica, and known that's where your home was. I mean, I was born in the flatlands of Eastern North Carolina. But back in 2014, at the suggestion of Carrie Brown, who I had met at a writers' conference, who said, "You need to go to Wild Acres," I showed up at Wild Acres in 2014 and took Luke Wisnet's class. And I got to meet you and got to meet other fascinating people in this little community of Wild Acres up on the Parkway, north of Marion, north of Asheville. And it was writing about, in that time I was writing my first book, which is set in those mountains, but there's a section of this book in which I returned to those mountains. And when I did, my editor and various editors said, there is something magical when you return to those mountains in this book. It is and I almost wanted to finish the sentence, it's a coming home. Yeah. So I adore the fact that I was able to pivot from my birthplace, my mother's homeland, back to the mountains of Western North Carolina, because it is a place I love.
It is a beautiful place. I meant to say, by the way, Leah and I are going to converse for, half an hour, 40 minutes, but we're going to turn to y'all for questions. So as you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. You should have that at the bottom of your screen. And we will go to your questions and comments pretty soon. So be a part of this. So this is a book in which two young women, Lucy and Allie Burt, who goes by Burt, become fast friends, and they're from very different parts of the same state. And they're very different in a number of ways. Lucy fancies herself kind of a Nancy Drew figure. And Allie Burt, who Burt, I guess is what we should call her, believes at first that Nancy Drew is a family member of Lucy's who she has somehow not met, which I loved.
Yeah.
How does Nancy Drew feature into this story? What's Nancy for between these girls?
Well, this is my very first book of writing a plot-driven book, and you, the teacher, would know all the terminology that I sort of stumble through. My first book was character-driven. My agent said, I want you to write a plot-driven book. So hence came my two girls that were telling the story, and I finally found my plot line, which was pretty much a perfect Nancy Drew mystery book, and that is The Mystery of the Missing Men.
Yeah.
And it fell perfectly because the book is set in 1943, 44, and 45 during the end of World War II. It fell perfectly into Nancy sort of becoming a big icon already. Her 19th book was published in 1943. But I knew that Nancy was mine, as probably so many women around America, around the world. I was around 10 or 11, so it was in the late 50s that I met Nancy and was completely enchanted and enamored. She was everything that I wanted to be, and she had a power that I dreamed of having, and she had a mind that really pitted against mine to figure out, when do I get that clue? When do I figure out what happened? So Nancy became a marvelous vehicle for these girls, especially for Lucy, who is quite bright. She loves to use large language. She's in sort of an enchanted family where they are storytellers, they're bibliophiles, they read, they raise honeybees. And then you have the contrast, which is Bert. So that yin and yang, those two opposites were what really had them work well together, both falling in love as good friends and then, butting heads a number of times. So Nancy was a great tool for us.
And Nancy Drew, what Carolyn Keene did with Nancy Drew was give women of a certain age and era, particularly Lucy and Allie Burt's, and then a little later you and a little later me, a way of owning how a young woman comes to interpret and manage her world. I mean, Nancy had the Roadster, she had George, and she had, what was her boyfriend,
oh my
Ned?
Gosh.
Yeah.
And she also had a friend with a male name, George. You know, a woman, a girl.
Yeah.
So that fit perfectly. That my Lucy has now a friend who insists on being calling Bert. So that was a fun comparison too.
That was terrific. You know, talking about plot driven versus character driven, so much happens in All the Little Hopes, and I'm not going to give it away. But I mean, you've got the German prisoner of war camp in basically rural North Carolina, and this was true. These did happen. You've got shape note singing, which we'll talk about a little bit, which is also called Sacred Harp singing. You've got a couple, three murders. You got bees. You got all kinds of stuff. This is a fast moving book. It really doesn't lag at all. And I'm curious, how do you, over my shoulder is some work for a new novel. So I'm curious, how do you organize your plots as you write? How did you do all that juggling?
Gosh, well, as you know, a lot of it's just doing and redoing, but it's also being open to things that just fall in your lap. For example, I thought that the German POWs were going to be the main thrust of the book. It was a nugget my mother gave me many, many years ago when she was talking about her past and said that there were German POWs helping at Tobacco Market. And I said, Mom, you must have been confused. And really back in those days, and this is 2004, 2005, there was virtually nothing online about that phenomenon, which I then found out was in 46 of our 48 states, 700 camps. There were 18 in my home state of North Carolina. So I thought that was going to be my main thrust. But I'll be honest with you, when I went to visit the museum in my birth town, there was a strange dichotomy that was going on. There were lots of wonderful memories about these Germans that were there, who were artists and who were musicians and who were farmers and who were teachers. So they were not the diehard Nazis that I thought I was going to get my teeth into and have a juicy story. I even met 6 people who remembered the POWs on their family farm. And from that meeting in the library, where we brought donuts and coffee to ply them with and sit around with a tape recorder in the middle, that's where I got the beeswax contract. That's where I found information about a phenomenon in North Carolina called purple honey. That's where I found about the Russian test pilots that were just maybe 50 miles away, who were testing planes that could land on the water to help protect our eastern seaboard.
Mhm.
It was an astonishing bevy of things, including the memory that these boys became almost family surrogates to these families, where they would fish in their family boat. They had some liberties. So it became then, what do I look for? The juicy part. And so the missing men thankfully solved that for us.
Okay, good. That was the framework, which kind of goes to my next question, which is a little bit about research, but you've kind of just spoken to that. But there's so much to manage. So I'm really curious, how did you personally, and I think everybody has their own technique for this, integrate research with plot? Because it's really hard. And as a person who writes historical novels now, apparently, you've got this, I've got this information, but how do I not do an info dump?
Exactly.
So how did you not do an info dump? And then I want to ask you about the earrings, because that's part of your research too.
Good. I think that when I steered away from trying to have a spotlight on a piece of history and chose to have a plot line in which I wove this history through it, that helped me a lot. It was gathering more than I could ever use. And then, of course, throwing a lot on the paper that a lot of it got disconnected or discarded. So it is, it's one of those things is, I can't really answer, because I'm not that organized, outline, lay things.
I don't either.
I've just got piles of things. I throw some things in there, and sometimes when I've got a little hint of something, it could have been major research in order to finally have that little hint come in that was authentic. I honestly, because I've only written 2 books, and because I'm still sort of a novice at this, I don't understand my process. People are always asking me, and I said, well, I have to prime the pump, then it gets going, and then it takes over like a fever. So, and then too, and I know that having great editors along the way who ask the right questions and have us cut the right things, that's weighting it down, that's fascinating, but not necessary. All of that's very, very helpful. It is not just me on my own little island.
Yeah. Or it is, and then it isn't. By the way, speaking of questions, y'all have questions for us, because we're going to want to talk to you. I had forgotten, by the way, about what happened to Glenn Miller in World War II. And when I got to that part in the book, I went, oh man, I had forgotten that, and you used it so well. Tell us about that, and then tell us about the earrings.
Okay. Well, let me start with my little earrings here, because there are 2 references in the book to cherries. And by the way, there could have been a third, which I will share with you in a moment. Don't let me forget number 3. But there is a reference in the beginning of the book, maybe in 5, 6, 7 chapters, in which there is the perfect cherry pie that the 2 girls bake to hopefully appease a certain situation, and then something catastrophic happens.
Yeah.
So that's a little a little seed with cherries, and then roll it ahead long into the book. The girls actually meet some college girls from up at in the north, and they come to town, and they are 5 years older than our girls, and therefore extraordinarily worldly. They truly could be Nancy Drew in their polish. Well, they're sitting there in the house with these 2 impressionable young girls, and one of the hostess says, we're going to get some moonshine, and I've got to, and they say, well, you need, Patricia, you need to do that naughty toast that you do. Now, the toast that I'm going to share with you came from my mother, who was a wonderfully nice woman, fabulous. She was my best friend the last 10, 15 years of her life after my dad died. And she would say this toast to my sister and I, and we would go, Mom, do you know what you're saying? The toast is this. So Jessica, raise your little glass of water. Here we go.
Okay. And this is not for youthful ears unless, right?
Right. This is
Okay.
well, I'm not sure if they would even understand.
Okay.
You know, in other words, that became the issue that our girls didn't understand. But the toast is: here's to the girl in the little red shoes. She'll smoke all your cigs. She'll drink all your booze. She doesn't have her cherry, but that's not a sin because she still has the box that the cherry came in. So that's the toast, and we clink, and we would go, "Mom, what are you doing?" So I use it in there, and of course, my girls, my 14-year-old girls at that time, are just confused. I mean, so that's kind of what happens. You know, they don't quite understand. They may finally find out later, but they can't understand the importance of a cherry in a box. So that doesn't. But that was a funny thing. Then, fascinatingly, I have the cover of the newspaper the day that the war ended. The big caption across the top is peace, and it's the Raleigh News and Observer. And I was looking over it. I had framed it for my mom and dad many, 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 many years ago, and I have it, and it's been hanging on my chest, my wall in the guest room. And I was looking over it the other day, and this was long after the book was done. And in it, there was for the North Carolina, a Governor Cherry, who had declared a 2-day holiday for the end of the war. And I said, oh my gosh, wouldn't I have loved to have put Governor Cherry in the end of the book, right when the war was over? Because someone would say I made it up. And then they would go look and find out there really was a Governor Cherry. So how funny is that?
Sometimes, I'm actually glad you didn't, because sometimes it's too perfect and people are like, oh, come on.
That's true.
Right?
That's very true. You're right.
Yeah. I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so we're going to get to those in just a second. So bring them on. You know, talking about things with double meanings, shall we say. Let's talk about the Wolpertinger, and thank you for teaching me to pronounce Wolpertinger.
Yeah.
It's quite the metaphor, and I'd like you to describe what it is and how you want the reader to use it as what, here I am as a writing teacher, call an abiding image, particularly since one of Lucy's favorite words is enigma.
Yes, mystery.
So give us some Wolpertinger.
All right, I'm going to put this up to the screen a little bit. There's a little sketch.
That's the Albrecht Dürer rabbit.
Yes, a rabbit. It's got wings, and he also has little antlers. And this is and I'm sure you have this happen in your own writing, Jessica, because I'm researching at that time, because the grandmother came from Germany, which was the land of marbles, which was the land of the Brothers Grimm, which was the land of the Black Forest. And off to the side of my screen comes these pictures of Wolpertingers. And I go, what is this? Well, back in the 1800s, when they were trying to perpetuate the mystery of that whole environment, there were literally taxidermists who would take parts of bodies and put them together and swear that in those special woods, these creatures that can be found nowhere else existed. And they actually had hunting parties so it was a big tourist thing for them. So I had one come to my little farm in eastern North Carolina that the grandmother brought in a wooden box, and it sat up on top of her Bavarian armoire. And story time was every night at the Brown family, but once a week was the community story time.
And this is in the book. They would get together. The Brown family gets together and has a read-along.
And the Wolpertinger would come out if it was kind of a spooky thing or a little scary thing. So the Wolpertinger became Lucy she thought it was just all fabricated. She's smart enough. She knows when she's being fooled, until later in the book, when she does return to my mountains, your mountains, and she walks in those high country and the land, and she questions herself and wonders if possibly this kind of land could produce something as magical as a Wolpertinger. So it was a amazing crossover in terms of stretching her imagination.
And stretching her imagination in terms of what we see versus what is made versus what is reality. What does the word Wolpertinger mean? How does that translate?
You know, I don't know. I whether it's sort of like moose or, something. I've never looked it up. Let's just say mystical, magical something.
Yeah.
This stretching of her imagination was very important, because at that time she was going back to Bert's home place for a specific trauma that had happened.
Right.
And what it allowed Lucy, who was quite cocky and confident of herself, taken out of her element, she realized how limited her world had been and that she did not know as much as she thought she did. So all of that transforming is taking place on that mountain ride.
You do a wonderful thing there because Lucy is book educated and she is more citified, for lack of a word, than Bert is. So there's an element of her looking down on Bert because Bert is Bert's country, right?
Yes.
And then we realize that once we get into Bert's environment with Lucy and see it through Lucy's eyes, Bert has this very deep natural intelligence that Lucy, not to say that Lucy's not intelligent, but it's a different way of living in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting thing that you do, developing their friendship. Lucy and Allie Bert become fast friends right away. I mean, like, boom, right out the gate. And throughout the book, they reassess each other continually, right? The part that you read, the part that I mentioned, they have some petty jealousies as teenage girls do, and honestly, as grown women do, you know, come on.
Yeah.
And they also have a great love for each other, as people do, right? So as you mentioned, Bert is faced with a tough decision when she goes home to deal with this family tragedy. So in what ways throughout the book do both girls grow up or mature?
Well, it opens with an interesting predicament in which Bert, in the mountain life, does not want to grow up and become a woman. She literally tries to minimize the developing body she's having. So
she binds her breasts.
She binds her breasts. And I knew that the development over that 3 years, that maturing was going to be part of the big narrative arc, that both girls coming from naivete to a really cataclysmic moment that when they cross over, it's an extraordinary coming of age, so to speak. But what was the big challenge, Jessica, was that I had a very educated Lucy, and I had a woman a young girl who spoke with poor dialect, misused words, but she was going to be growing and moving to connect to this family. And I had to very carefully have her development sound natural and to feel natural. So there's several times when Lucy, there's a time when she gets angry with her mother because she said, you talk to us, you stop us whenever we say one little thing wrong and you're not even talking about her. And the mother very wisely, and of course she is the grounding source in the book, the mother says she's learning a lot. She's got a lot to learn. And the last thing I want to do is have her make the journey harder than it has to be. So it's a lot of maturing. And Lucy, again, is not as smart as she thinks. She's book learned, but she's not. And that all takes place in a form of natural thing. I love the two older women that I have that do a lot of teaching of the ladies.
And that's exactly, you and I, this is a great segue. That's exactly where I'm going. Yeah. Speaking of the way people speak, Aunt Fanny Bell is the queen of malapropisms. She is fantastic. And you need comic relief in any book, and particularly in a book that involves Nazism, murder, and teenageness. Talk to me about Aunt Fanny Bell. I just love her. Where did you get the idea for her? And talk about the value of humor.
Okay. Well, Aunt Fanny Bell is a real person. She was my mother's aunt, and she was the richest lady in town. Her last name was Robertson, and our little town was Robertsonville. She lived in an antebellum home that had beautiful parquet floors on the first floor. And my mother remembers vividly Aunt Fanny Bell playing a honky-tonk piano, and Mama was roller skating on the parquet floors. So Aunt Fanny Bell, I knew, was sort of a character. So
I want to know who taught her how to play boogie woogie, because that's not easy.
So Scott, I guess Mama was born in 26, so there would probably have been Scott Joplin. Who knows what would have been coming out of that.
Ragtime.
So, but humor, I had a lot of it in my first book, in The Preacher, simply because, as you said, when you're dealing with hard topics, it's terribly important to have a chuckle. And I think when I found out that I had the capability to make people laugh, in in writing. I didn't understand how big it was, but I did understand how important it was. So Aunt Fanny Bell was this little powerhouse of, she took over whatever scene there was. But again, as you said, she misspeaks constantly, which has Lucy question it, but not enough to interrupt, because obviously whatever Aunt Fanny Bell is saying is pretty darn fascinating, because she takes us places that their regular world would not.
Yeah.
Everything from a pedophile to the Ouija board, to even back to the Trula Freed, who is this astonishing character that just walked out into my mind fully formed. So she had a lot to do in the book, and she did it perfectly.
Yeah, Aunt Fanny Bell is just fantastic.
Yes.
And doesn't she yell into the phone all the time?
Oh gosh, you can hear her all the way across, and she of course keeps going on as if she's omnipotent, that she can see everything and know everything, which they just kind of laugh at her and chuckle, because they know that's just the way she is.
That's how she is.
Yeah.
Trula Freed. Talk to me about Trula Freed.
Well, I love a spiritual element. In the first book, it was a mountain woman called Bertie Rokas. In this one, it was Trula Freed, who I adored the fact that she was mysticism that permeated itself in a necessary way in a number of the storylines. But she was just a kind of talk about enigma, talk about mystery. She was something that was just so magnetic for the girls. It was one of those things that they could not quite resist. When she stepped forward, this slender, tall woman in the caftans and the turbans and the bangles. And then when I got to go to her cabin, which had been transformed over the years to this glowing place, I mean, it was magical, and I love magic. I mean, I think, again, she served a great purpose, not only in having the girls question things, but it's important to know you don't know everything. And, so there are a couple of times I think Lucy thought she knew it all, and then she got taken down.
And Trula, yeah. You just said something really interesting, which is, and I don't even know if you did it intentionally, but, or else I tell my students, it's your subconscious. So you said, I got to go to her cabin. And my first thought was, oh, it's a real place. And you went. But then I realized what you mean is in your mind, you got to, that is a wonderful thing about writing, isn't it?
It is fabulous. And I've had some people say that they confuse it, but I like to write. And I think it's the goal of every writer to write cinematically. And that is that you are literally being pulled by the story in a visual scene. So literally, when I went to that red door, the painted door, with the doorknob, the brass doorknob that locked, which was extraordinarily powerful when I saw that, because back in that day, nobody locked their doors.
Right.
So it was an amazing thing that she could, if she wanted to. But it was when I walked into it, I thought, what would it look like? And when it glowed with its own light, this golden light, I mean, I thought, as a girl, would I just be enchanted, but also frightened?
A little freaked out, yeah.
A little frightened, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And Trula knows stuff. She has a second sight.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And then we have one of the children, the youngest girl has psychic abilities. And I didn't know that. Of course, I've got 7 siblings, including Lucy. And then here comes Bert to the family. So they each had to have their own distinct, not only personality, but their own distinct purpose in the story. So this little Lydia, who is, again, has the gift, has the sight.
And Lydia was a foundling, right? Lydia was a foundling.
Well, there was one of them that was actually a little, she was an albino that was found. But I just love all of the characters, because together they make a family, and they are both flawed. They're all flawed and funny in parts, and they butt heads. But it seemed like a believable family for me.
It absolutely was, and it was enchanting. We're gonna go to questions in just a second. We've got, it looks like 5 of them kind of circling LaGuardia there.
Alrighty.
So, what haven't I asked you before we go to reader questions?
Well, it's interesting because I've got a big event coming up in November in the town for which the German POWs camp is. And I was so thrilled as they are laying out the plans for me to come and speak and us to have a tour. An Eagle Scout has actually put a marker where the German POW camp was. When Dave and I've been many times, we've had to sort of seek it out ourselves. The museum has it, but it's an exciting thing to have a little town that is proud of a special piece of history, and to have the light shine on them. I didn't use any of the names, including the town. I apologize to them in the back of the book because I just didn't want to maybe make a mistake. But I loved being able to walk on that soil and having spent my childhood there. I was only maybe 10, 15 years off of kind of knowing where these girls would have been.
Yeah.
So that was exciting to kind of live these months in my mother's world. So
That's lovely. That's wonderful.
Thank
So
you.
let's see. Well, who's got a question here?
Good.
Melissa Royce says,
Oh, hey, Melissa. I
The
saw
cover
her
of the-
in Greenville,
okay.
South Carolina.
She actually has two questions, but the first one is, the cover of the book is so perfect. How much input did you have, Leah, to the creation of the cover, and how important do you think a book cover is?
Well, I have this much, Melissa, that much, which is a big zero, a big fat zero. I remember the first time signing the first book contract, and it says very clearly that they had the final word on the book cover. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what if I hate it? Well, I didn't. I loved it. This one, I just relinquished the reins. And this one, interestingly, comes from a photographer who lives in El Dorado, Arkansas. She reached out to me when the cover came out. I had nothing to do with the cover, but this is the fascinating story behind the cover. Her mother now has Alzheimer's, this photographer, but this particular shot, her mother helped her pick out the setting. They went and picked out the girls' dresses, and they set up this shot of, and I'm sure that the photographer was just busy putting things out there and letting the universe figure what goes where. But the fact that this is a story that stemmed from my mother's memory, that nugget, and her mother's involvement was extraordinarily special. I immediately looked up El Dorado, Arkansas, and it's about 14 hours from me because I was going to see, is there some way that I can go through and say hello to her? But it's quite striking and quite special.
Yeah.
And it's kind of suits it perfectly.
It's beautifully
Thank you,
balanced,
Melissa.
that photograph. And there's something really nuanced about the fact that we don't see the girls. We see them from like here
Yes,
down.
and the original picture, by the way, has the full house and of course the full girls there. But that then I think Source Books does a wonderful job of kind of focusing on place and on a plot rather than on the actual characters. So they eliminate it and you can fill in with, the little details that you want. Good question, Melissa.
Yeah. Cheryl Rosenfield wants to know about the prisoners of war. And Cheryl asks, the prisoners of war were able to be part of the community? So let's tell a little bit more about that.
When I first was researching it and found out there were 18 camps in North Carolina, something like 700 camps all across America, some of which didn't have some happy stories, but I'm only dealing with my little portion of North Carolina. And when I went there, I was hoping to find some sort of juicy clash, something that would have, again, meat on the bone that I felt like could be, part of the tough part of the book. Instead, what I found was, when I say an enchanted story, when there is a section in the book, and it's an important part of the book, but it isn't spoil it if I tell you, I had this truth, and that is that when the German POWs knew the war was over and that they would be leaving in a few months, they made a 16-piece nativity scene with their carpenters, their painters, and presented it to the town of Williamston. And they said, we want you to never forget us. That's the kind of amazing memory they had. I received in the mail a menu that was printed by the camp, the POW camp, and there were people from town who went on Sundays after church to eat at the commissary. Now, I'm hearing this and I'm saying it's almost unbelievable, and I don't really want to tell that kind of story. But I was busy collecting some quite beautiful things that had the boys become grateful to be there. They were not part of the ilk that was Nazis. They were, again, this other background. So that was this little town's memory of the German POWs. So I chose to give a little bit of, especially the rough fear of them coming to town, but then I sort of let the story alone. I mean, we just sort of pushed them aside because I didn't want to dirty it. I didn't want to make them a bad guy, somebody that got out and killed somebody in town or threatened something. So and I've heard other stories where there were other camps where the actual died in the wool Nazis, and the others that there was a great head clashing and problems. So there were different stories in different parts of the world. There were love stories. There were many of the Germans returned to America, having fallen in love with America. That was something that I had not expected, and it presented a problem to me. And that is a sweet story that didn't give me the angst that I needed for a juicy story.
Mhm.
But the town is told me the truth, so that's
Yeah.
so we just didn't mess with it.
There was a book when I was a teenager called The Summer of My German Soldier.
Yes,
Yeah.
I read that.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's kind of normal, where there's, again, a romantic thing and they're trying to get away across the northern border or something, I think. And so that's more of a traditional thing. I chose to make my girls 13, 14, and 15
Younger,
in
yeah.
hopes of eliminating the romantic angle of it.
Right, right. And that strikes me as a wise choice, because
Yeah.
that way you get to focus on the whole Nancy Drew kind of thing, and
Yeah.
how the girls mature as
Yes.
people rather than as love objects.
Yes,
Which doesn't mean
exactly.
that they're not aware of love and sex and dating and boys and girls and whatever, but it's not what's right in front of their face. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anonymous attendee, although I think I know who it is, but I'm not going to say. Anonymous attendee says, you describe yourself as a Southern writer and you write Southern stories. What do you think stories about the South have to add to our historical understanding? What do stories about the South do for our historical understanding?
Okay. I think, first of all, it's the language, because there is a marvelous, there's a lilt, there's the humidity, which I think that part of it, or the mountain high. But I think there is a whole languid way. If you've ever been to a Southern town and sat on a bench, especially back in that day with no air conditioning, and I don't even know, some places maybe had the big fans, maybe not. I think it's also the fact that a lot of the South is farming, tobacco, peanut. And so it's very much connected to the land in a way that's different from the cities or timber or something like that. So I call myself that probably because I've lived here most of the time, and I wasn't really sure. Some of my early writing was probably not only focused on Southern, but when I wrote the first book, and it was definitely Southern, set in Appalachia, which was a great undertaking on its own. It was, I knew that was the type of character that I wanted, both everything from the flawed character, but the very rich to the earth, to the hardworking, the blue collar type of working, which was my mother. My mother was one of 15 children born on a tobacco farm with no running water and no electricity. We had the ice box on the back porch, the outhouse. We had the big feather bed that my grandmother would punch holes in and throw us children into. And we were to stay there all night as she knelt and said her prayer and climbed into bed. That is my memory and my upbringing. So I love that kind of grittiness, that kind of hardworking. My mother never thought of herself as poor, but on almost any spectrum, they were. But there was music, there was storytelling, there was, they were all very bright. So, so all of that influenced me in a very big way to be, therefore, dedicated to the Southern voice.
And talking about the historical approach, and we've got another question from Melissa and one from Becky. I'm going to say Zagor if I pronounced it incorrectly. Becky, let me know. But from a historical standpoint, you talk about, in this book, you talk about shape note singing or sacred harp singing, and you talk also about the German soldiers, the POWs, which, the history, if you don't write about it, talk about it, witness it, it fades over time. And I think there may very well be people reading this book who are reading it and going, what? That didn't happen.
Yes.
But it did. And so
I'm so excited for them to be Googling things and said, really, this is a real thing? I did cheat in the back and give a long list saying, how many did you get right? But it was the shape note singing, which was an extraordinary gift to me when I was at Wild Acres at a writing my own week-long, when I was in residency alone starting this book. I was going up to supper each night, and there was on campus a shape note from all over the country, a group of people singing 4-part harmony, which is a love of mine. And I would just walk over after supper and sit in the back. And there came the night when they gave me this and had me come to the center of the square. And the power of this voice literally held me up and brought me to tears. And I knew whatever I wrote, that was going to end up in the book. So it is gifts that are given to you that are so powerful that there will be a moment when that happens. And there's a perfect moment laid in the book when that experience I could put on paper and not guess at it. I experienced it.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know shape note singing or fa sol la, look it up. Use Dr. Google and look it up and listen to it. I see we have a question from, hi, Anshu Gupta. It came in the chat. I've got 2 ahead of you, Anshu. So Melissa wants to know, what is your schedule like when you're writing, and do you even have one?
I wish that I was logical. And I think if I'd started 30 years ago, it would be a little different. I was 70 when my first book was published. And I was retired when I signed with a New York agent. And it pivoted back on when I had 2 major losses. My mother and my love, Jim, close together. They died of cancer. And I was left with these huge blocks of time that I could devote to writing. I would go to work and I would write. And I'm learning a craft of which I knew nothing about. So my first ones were short stories. I wrote a novel that did not sell. My first novel did. Then I finally had one that did sell. And what happens is that it makes sense that it's a struggle at the beginning, and in the middle it begins to gather steam. You begin to have things pump out, and then literally it hits a fever pitch. When you just don't hardly want to eat, go to the bathroom, sleep, or anything. Oh my gosh. And it's always spinning in your mind because now you see where it's going and what's happening. So I had, in all of those early years, I had lived alone. So I'm going to work, come home. I get to devote all my extra times to writing. And then I met an amazing man back in 2016. And in 2017, he became my husband. I had been single for 21 years, or 26 years. So Dave has added a lot to my life, but he truly lets me enjoy the writing world without any guilt. So I'm always writing. We're in the car, I've got my laptop open, a book open, but at the same time, I have learned that I can walk away. The characters will be there.
You're not driving when you have the laptop open, are you?
He's driving.
Okay, good, just checking.
Yeah, no, we have Wi-Fi and he's driving. But what's nice is that time in between is a good thing, as you know. Now you come back and it makes more sense. So I'm not at all one of these people like my dear friend Kathleen Grissom, who writes every day from 1 to 5. That sounds amazingly, simple. 1 to 5.
I'm so jealous.
Doesn't that sound good? At 5 o'clock, I might be really popping things out and don't want to take a break. So it is the joy of having it grab you that you're kind of looking for.
I am so jealous. I get 2 hours before I have to go teach.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but there's an element of starting gun, do it. But you're right about having, I'll send myself emails throughout the day and things like that. So it's always cooking in your mind. Becky Zagor says, I loved the book. Talk a bit about the impact or impression of having a mother on both girls and why that was important to address. So I think Becky's asking about the role of a mother on both Lucy and Bert.
Yes, especially the mother that Bert lost at the very beginning of the book, and then the aunt that she comes to take care of, who is suffering from depression and a breakdown. I think I used them more as tools because it was obviously a thing that Bert wanted to separate herself from, and that led her eventually to the Brown family. I think that I handle it delicately. We go to a mental hospital. We get to know how debilitating it is, and we get to know how difficult it is to reach them sometime. So I hope that then I pivoted away and that we then had light and encouragement in Bert's life when we had this wonderful Brown family come and show her that there are other ways. There's another way to live life. Yeah.
I forgot the part about unmuting myself. Okay, we have one more question and then I think we got to wrap it up. We're coming into about 6 minutes to 8. Anshu from Wild Acres is here with 2 questions. So I'm going to pick the first one. Anshu says, do you know what was the fate? Let's see, it rolled on me. Hang on. You're welcome, Linda. Do you know what was the fate of the German POWs in the town? Were they released and go back to Germany, or what happened to them?
The interesting thing is that when the war ended in August of 1945, it was a massive undertaking to reconfigure the world. So it was months. It wasn't until the following spring that they left. In other words, we had everything from the guys just couldn't come, the army or the military men just couldn't come home. But my understanding is that they were not sent back home, that they were sent to either England or France to help rebuild them. So there were some of our men and women that were left in those war-torn countries where the POWs were brought back to help to clean up and to establish some sort of order. So what they had to go back to depends on where they were from, I think. I have a dear German friend who was about 3 during World War II, and she said that she was out in a farming district and she said they barely knew the war existed. So it's like a lot of parts of it, there are parts that were going to be heavily impacted. So but they did not just get to go home, Andrew. They didn't get to just be released and then walk back, because we had about 50 million people. They had 5 million roaming around Europe alone, trying to find a way to find some semblance of order. And it was chaos, just chaos. So it wasn't a happy ending for them. And gradually our boys came back, including a lot of my mother's brothers and my daddy. So we didn't lose anybody in the war. So we were extraordinarily lucky, but we had a lot of damage left as a result of that.
Yeah. Leah, this has been so terrific. I'm going to invite Claire to come back and she can tell us how to purchase All the Little Hopes and also The Magnetic Girl. And I just have to wrap it up by saying there's a wonderful surprise at the back of this book, which is a recipe, right? Actually, there's 2. There's A Taste of Hope. There's Oma's German marble cake. So in addition to everything else, there are also 2 recipes, and there's cornbread.
Yep. Well, my Aunt Susie's cornbread, which I absolutely adore. But Oma's marble cake was actually a nod to the marble playing that plays a very big part in here.
Yeah.
And also the Germans, who were the world-class marble makers. And lo and behold, when I looked up Oma and I'm looking up marble cake, there's literally a recipe, and I went, well, I'll be darned, I need to make that. So I did. And it became something I just decided to throw into the book that again was an homage back to her Germany.
It was lovely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Jessica. Wonderful to see you, my dear. Miss Claire, we turn it over to you.
Thank you. And Leah and Jessica, thank you so much. It's just such a insightful and delightful conversation this evening. I so enjoyed it. I know that our audience did as well. So, like I said, Leah sold her book too well. So we'll have our copies of All the Little Hopes available for you all to purchase from Atlanta History Center's museum store. And you will get a follow-up email after tonight's event that'll give you a recording of tonight's conversation so you can share it with your friends and family who weren't able to make it. And that will also include the link for you to purchase the book. If you enjoyed tonight,
Now, Claire, I was going to say, I sent some signed book plates. I'm happy to send more, but that's an incentive for people to get it directly from Atlanta, your history center. And that way they can have a little piece of something special.
Yeah, absolutely. Leah did send us some really beautiful signed book plates. So that's another perk that you would have. That's something special since we weren't able to gather in person and have them hand signed. But if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, we have lots of things coming up in the fall, actually a mixture of virtual and in-person for a couple in-person events. Rest assured that we have COVID protocols in place, included limited capacity and required masks. So if that's something that you're looking to do, I know that everyone here is a historical fiction fan, so we're hosting Patty Callahan in conversation with Emily Giffen. Yeah, I'm really excited. At the end of October, and she'll actually be in person at our Buckhead campus. We'll be streaming it as well, so if you're not in the Atlanta area or just don't quite feel like getting out, we understand. So that's available for you. And I will put a link in the chat right now where you can find all of our upcoming talks. And one other small plug I have to give for Atlanta History Center is that we are seeking volunteers to help us learn more about how our museum impacts your experience when you come and visit us. So if you want some free museum tickets and all you have to do in return is just share your thoughts, I put a link to the survey, the nationwide survey we're participating in the chat as well. But Jessica, Leah, thank you again so much for kicking off our weekend a little bit early in such a beautiful way. And just congratulations, Leah. Just
thank you
wonderful
so much,
to host you. And I know that you're saying your previous book continues to do well. So that's that's
yes,
really
it
wonderful.
does. Very exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. This has been a pleasure. Leah, I hope to see you on the mountain.
You will next year for sure.
All right, man. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.